Okay.
Am I talking loudly enough?
Yeah.
Okay. When I was born in Goodnight, my dad took my two older brothers, Herman and JR, who were 7 and 5 years old at that time, down to the store and that afternoon sometime, and they met Colonel Goodnight there. He came in and he greeted the boys and asked them, said, "What do you think about this new baby brother you've got?" And Herman spoke up first. He had something on his mind, and he said, "Well, I think I'd like to sell him." He said, so he wanted to know what he wanted to sell him for. He figured that boy had something on his mind that he wanted, and so he asked him. He said, "Well, what would you sell him for? How much was it running?" He said, $297. He said, $297? He said, "What cost $297?" And he said, "One of those tricycles hanging up there." They had just gotten a shipment of tricycles in. So later that afternoon, 2 tricycles, one a little larger than the other, was sent to the house for the 2 boys from Colonel Goodnight, because he figured that if Herman wanted a tricycle enough to sell a baby brother, that he deserved a tricycle.
So he got the 2 tricycles, right? He got the 2 tricycles.
What?
He got 2 tricycles for Herman and JR?
Yeah, 2 tricycles, one for Herman and one for JR. And I have no real memories of my own of Goodnight. I just haven't, I wasn't quite 4 when we left there. But a couple of weeks before I was born, a cousin, Lee Merzel Elder, was born, and the 2 of us had quite a bit to do with each other because our mothers were always getting together, especially during summer vacations. And so we had a lot of pictures of the 2 of us. And this, I need to hold the picture up. Anyway, this picture of the 2 of us labeled, at a rather early age, we could hardly sit up, but they took our picture together. And another picture that I wanted, not because I remember anything particular, but because it is of my Aunt Leela Gray and myself when I was still quite young. I was still wearing baby clothes in it. She was the first wife of my Uncle Wilson, the mother of Cleo, my cousin Cleo. And I don't remember her because she died sometime. I would have to look up to get the date of her death. I could do that. But this is a very good picture of her. And Cleo apparently looked kind of like her mother, resembled her quite a bit, according to this picture. And I just wanted the picture because there were so few pictures of Leela. And this picture of Merzel, well, myself being held up by JR and Merzel being steadied by Herman, was made, I don't know where, but someplace in Goodnight, obviously, because we were still pretty young there. We looked like we might be a little over a year old, but that would be about it. And this is another picture. I was probably, I would say maybe 2 years old in this one. And it's a picture of Daddy holding me, or standing me between his legs, and he and JR and Herman sitting on the porch in Goodnight. And this is obviously the same house as that picture was made in. So I wonder if I was born in that house too. I'll never know now. Because the only one of us being born there that Mom ever talked about was Ophelia. And finally, this is my favorite little boy picture of me. sitting on the porch waiting for J.R. and Herman to come home from school. So I must have been about 3.5 or 4 when this picture was made. But Mom said I would get real lonesome in the afternoon. I'd play just fine all day long, but when it was about time for the boys to come home, I would get lonesome and go out and sit on the porch and wait for them. And that is my memories of good old Goodnight. You want this put in the picture?
Yeah.
And we moved to Borger from Goodnight when, of course, Ophelia was born at Goodnight. And I don't remember anything about her being in the picture there, but she was. And but she was about not quite 2 when we moved to Borger. And the Borger was a rip-roaring oil town. The town grew up because the rancher who owned the whole area around there had needed water badly for his cattle. His cattle were dying of thirst, and so he sunk a well, and he didn't get water. He got oil, and he was very unhappy with it. And that well, the last time I was in Borger, which was probably 50 years ago, over 50 years ago, that well was still pumping oil at that time. It was right across the street from the post office now. Imagine that they would just leave it there, even if it wasn't pumping oil, just to okay. But in Borger, I had my last sibling was born, James Arthur. We were living in, as I said, Borger was a wide open town. No one intended to live there very long. They would come, make very good money for a while, and enough they could get a little bit of money saved, even quite a bit of money at that time saved, working in the oil field, and move on to a greener pasture, because there was nothing but the oil industry in Borger at that time. Hardly any stores except just the things that had to be. My dad opened a seafood food store. He sold, he imported oysters and that type of thing, and fish, and sold them. That's what he had going there. But and we were fortunate. We lived on the east side of town, and Borger was a little over a mile long, and say two or three streets wide was all, and made up of more or less hastily thrown up shacks. And we were fortunate that we had 2 of them side by side to live in, because most people did real well if they had one to live in, simply because of the shortage of them. And one day the day that James Arthur was born, they put us kids in one of the houses and Mama was in the other. And I didn't understand what all was going on. But then finally, I was watching out the door, and it was closed, but I was watching out through the window, and this doctor drove up in his little Model A, or was it I guess he had a Model A by then, and got out and went into the house where Mom was, and I asked what was going on, and J.R. said, well, we're going to have a new baby. And I said, how do you know? And he said, well, you can just tell. And he couldn't give me an answer. But then the doctor came running out of the house to his car and picked up his little black bag and ran it back into the house with it. And J.R. said, you saw what the doctor just did? I said, yes. And I said, he went outside to get the baby. He said, doctors bring babies in little black bags like that. And he said, after a while, the doctor will quite sauntily go back to his car and drive off. And then a little while later, they'll call all of us over to the house to see our new baby. We'll find out then what it is, a boy or a girl, because nobody knows until the doctor brings them. And he said, and so I believed J.R.'s story about birth until I was about 10 or 11 years old. It's unbelievable that I would be so naive, but I was. I knew a lot of other things I shouldn't have known, but I didn't know about birth until then. Anyway, also, the winter we were there, we had an English bulldog, and she had a litter of pups in the middle of winter. And J.R. and Herman dug a maze out in the backyard for the pups to play in. And we would stand on the back porch of one of the houses and watch the pups play in the maze. And it was a lot of fun because there must have been 5 or 6 of the pups, and they really enjoyed romping in the snow like that. Well, they didn't actually. They would stay out of the snow, but they would chase each other around through the maze. And then one night we have a postcard picture of the result of that. That was in 1926. Middle of the night, a well exploded in town. And at that time, oil wells were drilled right in the town area because the town wasn't organized enough to have any restrictions made about such things. And one of them exploded in the middle of the night, and I don't know if there were any people killed, but the fire was rather devastating, and on the postcard showing the results of some of it, it says that it only took about 60 days for the town to be rebuilt. So that shows you how fast buildings were thrown up at that time. And that was a rather exciting time because we lived far enough away from it that it didn't affect us. But you never knew how far a fire like that might spread because of the shortage of water. Water was at a premium there. And along that same line, Mom several times mentioned that, well, the people in Border were the friendliest people that we ever lived around. But she said, and they would give you anything that you needed that they had, and you didn't have to worry too much about paying back unless it was a cup of water. But she said if you had to borrow a cup of water even, that you would always pay back the water. Said you could borrow a couple of eggs or a cup of flour or something like that, and forget it. But you wouldn't forget about a cup of water because water was too dear there. And to continue the fire thing, one afternoon, this was in pretty good weather. It was must have been the spring before we left there, or the fall rather, before we left there. The Phillips camp burned down. The Phillips camp was a big quadrangle of one-room divisions. There would be a bathroom and a kitchen area and a place for beds to be put, and that was about all it was made of. And the people who worked at the Phillips camp, about a mile or so away, were all of them who could live there because they didn't charge them anything to live there. And one afternoon, the thing caught fire, and we stood in our backyard and watched the people throwing things out their windows and evacuating as fast as possible before the fire would reach them, because there wasn't enough water around to fight a fire normally. They just let the place burn down. And that was an exciting time too. So my first memories of good old exciting Borger were quite interesting. And another thing, someone had left an old car kind of at just off our backyard in Borger. And there was a little girl about my age lived in the next house to us, and we liked to go play in that thing. And one day I slammed the door, or she slammed it on me, and caught one of my fingers in the door and just mashed it flat. And Mom just wrapped it up good and treated it probably with alcohol would be the only thing to make it germ-free that she'd have, and wrapped it up. And after a week or two, I didn't know anything had ever happened. It just cured itself. And I couldn't even tell you which finger it was now. But and that really is pretty well summarizes my memories of good old Borger. Let's see what else have I got here. That seems to just about tell it, that part of the story. Which brings us to Perryton. James Arthur had been born on June the 10th. I don't remember the day in Borger. And then just say a month or so after that, we moved to Perryton. And we lived in Perryton until 1936, and we moved into Pampa. And the memories of Perryton are varied and numerous. One thing that was rather interesting that I want to tell about, one Christmas, or was it Thanksgiving? Anyway, we had all gone to Grandma and Grandpa's place, Cunningham's. The Cunninghams lived down about 100 miles below us, and I'm not even sure the name of the place now. It was just a rural community. And but when Grandmother Cunningham put out on the call that she wanted her children someplace for something special, they went. So we went. And and one afternoon, my cousin, who was the oldest of the Cunninghams, Alvin. But strangely enough, there was a 2 barbed wire fence between the house and the outhouse. And Grandma had always complained about that because she didn't like crawling between the wires to get to the outhouse. But one afternoon, when we were all there, us kids were all out, probably farther away than the outhouse, and somebody said, and we were going back to the house for something, and somebody yelled about, last one there's something or other. And we don't say words like that now anymore. But anyway, and so we all took off for the house, and Alvin got to the fence first, and he didn't realize that he had forgotten about the fence, and he just plowed into it and gashed one of his cheeks open, just laid it open. I mean, you could see his teeth in there. And so they had to rush him to the country doctor who sewed him up. And it was kind of strange because he was a good-looking kid and was really a young, handsome man when he grew up. And that scar gave him a dashing look that he never would have had otherwise. And speaking of snowstorms, we went to Grandma and Grandpa's house one Christmas. It was the Christmas that Ophelia got her doll, Mary Nell, and we rode. Daddy was working at a lumber yard as a drayman, and he had his own truck. And so when we traveled like that, Mama and Daddy and James Arthur and Ophelia would all sit in the cab, and the J.R. Herman and myself would sit up by the cab, wrapped up in blankets to keep warm. And it was a lot of fun, really, and we didn't get cold that way. And I remember coming home when there was a heavy snowfall. And, there's another story about before that snowfall. The storm had started, and the story about Alvin must have been a Thanksgiving, but anyway, this was in dead of winter, and they were having a heavy winter, and a storm was brewing, and everyone had arrived except the elders, Aunt Velma and Uncle Prentice and their children. And of course, we were anxious for them to get there because they had children our age. And right after lunch, Grandpa sat in his big chair and took a nap. And when he woke up, he said, Stella, you better get something hot for the travelers to get. He said they're going to arrive in about an hour, and he said they're going to be cold and want something to warm them up with. And Grandma didn't question him at all. She just went about having a snack ready for them and such. And sure enough, at the exact time he had said, they drove up. And they said, well, they were a little slow because of the storm that was brewing, but that they hadn't really had any trouble. And Grandpa would have dreams like this. And so no one questioned him about it. He just, and they said that he used to have them quite often, but that was the only one that I remember definitely him having. But then that storm turned out to be quite a storm. They ended up with nearly 2 feet of snow on the ground, just level. And that was good farming country, and so the snow was really welcome because snow puts a lot of nitrogen in the air and in the ground, and good fertilizer, you know. Anyway, when we went home, Daddy wasn't afraid of getting stuck in the snow because those trucks had big wheels and everything. But and when we were driving along, and there wasn't a sound except the sound of the car, the truck, and all at once, this huge, open, flat field should have been just burst with jackrabbits. I mean, they had been snuggled down under the snow, and but the sound of the truck disturbed them, and so they jumped, and it was just an eruption, really. And that was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in nature, was those jackrabbits just going crazy from the sound of this truck going by in the middle of winter. And then I started school. And in the first grade, I had Mrs. Kelly. Her husband was the girls' basketball coach. And and people were always talking about, well, that it wasn't right to have a man teaching girls like that. And but there never was a scandal that I knew of. Anyway, Mrs. Kelly was my first teacher, and she was really good. And my first day in school, she had written our names above the blackboard, and she put each one of us under our name with with an eraser and a stick of chalk, and we had to learn to write our name that day. Well, actually, we were drawing our name, but we learned to draw our names that day in longhand, not in printing, because they never allowed us to print until we were in the 4th grade, and we were taught to print then as part of the art class. But so when I went home that night, and Dad said, well, how was school day? And I said, just fine. And he said, well, what did you learn today? And I said, I can write my name. And he said, no, you can't do that. And he really didn't believe me. And so I showed him, and I wrote my name. And that was one of the proudest moments of my life. I never will forget that. Anyway, and Mrs. Kelly had a distinct place in my heart because she was the only teacher who ever laid a hand on me. And one day she caught me, she was out of the room for a minute. She came back in, and I was gotten up and was pestering somebody or something anyway, making noise. And she caught me at it and switched my legs with a switch that she had just a piece of some kind of a low bush, and ordinarily it would have stung like everything, but I had on a new pair of coveralls, and so I hardly felt it. Those things were just like a board between me and it, and it was all I could do to keep from laughing. And then I felt real guilty about it because she really meant to hurt me, and I needed hurting, and so I felt sorry because I got away with that. Then the next picture here is the picture of the Gray Kids with an unknown boy and girl. I was the oldest one standing there, and Ophelia, with a little plaid skirt on, had a boy and a girl, probably a neighbor, in the picture. And James Arthur was standing in front of me. He looks like he's about 2 to 3 years old, maybe. So we were all growing up, and my 2nd grade teacher was a Miss Widgren. I had her in 1931, 1932. I don't remember anything in particular about her, but my teachers obviously did a pretty good job of teaching us, because I learned to read quickly, and I love to read, still do. And it was, and then people. This is a picture of Joe Johnston, who was the son of Mrs. Agnes Johnston that my dad and his family had known. And at his feet is old Beans. Beans was a little Boston Terrier who had been really mistreated by her owner, and he had just dropped her off at a filling station, said anybody wanted that dog, they could take it, because she was never going to be worth anything. And Daddy took pity on the dog. I'll tell you about her first, and then I'll tell you about Joe. We had that dog for 16 years, and then a next door neighbor, we're not sure which one, fed her meat with ground glass in it. It was a horrible death, but and each fall, beginning of winter, she would have a litter of pups. Daddy bred her. She was She was a well-bred dog herself, had good markings, you could tell that. But she had shed all of her hair because the guy had dipped her in some kind of a dip to get rid of fleas, and then rinsed her in kerosene and turned her loose. And so she had lost all of her hair. When Daddy brought her home, she really was pitiful looking because she didn't have a hair on her. And it was in the winter, and we were living right by the railroad tracks still. I remember then on the north side of town. And Mama had never allowed any kind of a pet to be in the house. And so she made a bed for the dog outside, so she would be covered up and everything. But she heard the dog whimpering in the cold, and she couldn't take it. She got up and moved the dog's bed into their bedroom, and she never slept outside again. But in the winter, she would always have a litter of pups up, and those little pups like that had to be kept in the house. And the winters were usually pretty heavy then too. And so we always had our Christmas tree up on a table as a result of this. And 30 or 40 years later, Mama still always put her Christmas tree up on a table instead of on the floor, just out of habit, I guess. Anyway, the young man in this picture, Joe Johnston, was the son of Agnes Johnston, who was an old friend of the Gray family. She had been married and had 3 or 4 children, and then her husband died, and she had made a living for her family as a newspaper woman down in South Texas. And then she met Mr. Johnston and had 3 more sons, and we never knew her first family. They were all grown and gone before we knew them. But Joe was just a year or so older than JR, and so we saw a lot of him. And he was my idol as a teenager, as an early boy growing up. And this picture was made in 1931. And I've often thought, now, how could I have been so stupid as to have him for an idol? Because there really wasn't much to him. He drank too much. He finally married a girl, and they had a baby, and the baby died. And 2 or 3 years, another year or 2 years later, he just walked out on them. And she ended up getting a divorce and marrying, and then David, who really was a prince of a fellow, married her. He said that he had a choice of 2 people to marry, my cousin Zora Gray, who was a beauty and a school teacher, or he could marry Faye, this girl that his brother had abandoned. And he said that Zora would always be able to take care of herself. She would, but Faye had never worked, anything like that. And he said Faye needs someone to take care of her, so he married her.
And Agnes Johnston was the one with the cataracts?
Yes, Agnes and Mrs. Johnston. Agnes had cataracts. All for the first few years that I knew her, I thought of her as being blind, although she was able to make. She would learn her way around a room or something, and she still did simple cooking for her family and things like that. And I don't know how she did as much as she did. But then one years later, she was. They owned a citrus grove, a big citrus grove down in the Rio Grande Valley, and they went down there for the winter to take care of their fruit and get them all taken care of and harvested, and then they would come back up to the Panhandle. They lived in Oklahoma, just near Uncle Arthur's place, and were wheat farmers up there, and worked out pretty well for them. But she would always, the nice thing about her is every time they went down, then for Christmas she would send us a full bushel basket of fruit that they had handpicked out of their own orchards. And good, fresh fruit. There was no doubt about it, But Mrs. Johnson, as I said, had cataracts and for all reasonable purposes, blind. She had had the cataract operation one time, and the doctors wouldn't try a second operation then. This was back in the 30s. So it was 70 years ago, nearly 80 years ago that I first met her. But one afternoon, after lunch, and the men had gone back out to work, she laid down to take a little nap, like she always did. And when she woke up, she rubbed her face and eyes with her hands, and she said it like scared her to death because she saw their hand on one side. And the cataract had started receding. So she went right to the doctor, and the doctor said he had never heard of that happening. But one of her cataracts receded, and so she was able to read again. And I know anytime we would go see her, she would have things that she wanted us to read to her. And she listened to the radio constantly, and she probably was the most up-to-date person I've ever known, although she was blind and couldn't read for so long. But in her later years, she was able to read again. And back to school in Perryton, they always had a big program of some kind of school, and they would have them sometimes 2 or 3 of them a year, and they would get us kids in all kinds of wild things, wild costumes. And I have a bunch of pictures of me in my costumes. This one, I'm a turtle. I remember that thing because it was so awkward to get around in. I'll just mention a couple or 3 of them. I was a priest in one. Here I was supposedly holding a Bible and giving a blessing to my people. And I was an Indian in another one. And I have one with me and our dog Toodles, one of Bean's pups, that we kept because she was perfectly marked. But she was the dumbest dog God ever made. Her mother, Beans, was the smartest dog, and she was the dumbest. But she was a beautiful thing. And I was an animal trainer, and she was supposed to be my lion or something. And this, and this famous raindrop costume. Mom made me a pair of white pajamas with an old sheet that she had, and then she hung just silver and gold strands of anyway, kind of like icicles, and draped the thing with that, and had little raindrops here and there in it. So I was a little raindrop there. I was a pilgrim in another one. She didn't put dates on those pictures. And then I have a couple of pictures of myself and my best friend, Charles Linville. We were inseparable for a number of years. I met him, I remember him in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. He was a lonely child because he lived with his grandparents and had no brothers and sisters. So he almost became a member of our family. And we did song and dance things together and all that kind of thing. And I have a couple of pictures of us here. And then other pictures, I've already talked about them. The last group of pictures here, it must have been made when when we were, well, I've already talked about this bunch, the picture of Ophelia and me and James Arthur with a little girl standing in the picture, and I don't know who she is, but and I started in the 4th grade. I had a teacher named Miss Allred. She was a big Indian woman from Oklahoma someplace, and I was scared to death of that woman because just because of her size, she just was intimidating to me, and I was scared to death of her. And at the end of the year, she gave me the award for being the best citizen boy of the year, and I was so shamed by that because I disliked her so much, and I said, how could she do that to me? Give me that award. And but a very big event in Tampa was the Dust Bowl starting. That was the first big dust storm we had was on a Sunday afternoon. It was a beautiful, perfectly wonderful fall day, and I had been spending the weekend. I was spending the weekend with a friend from school. That we were out in the country, and all about the middle of the afternoon, we saw this line of something all across the horizon, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and blacker and more threatening. And the closer it got, the worse it was, because you could see that it was dirt, and it had a lot of whirlwinds in it and such, obviously, and how such dense dirt could be carried like that. So much of it was a mystery at the time, but and we went into the storm cellar, which they used to store food in and such for the winter, and they had a drop light in it, a single light in the middle of it, and the dust in the air down in the storm cellar got so heavy that you couldn't hardly make out the light. It was so thick. We stayed in it until it was time to go milk the cows, and you milk the cows when it's time to milk the cows, if you're a farmer. And so we came out at that time, and the wind had died down some. It was still blowing strong, and the dust was still being blown, but not like it had been. And when we went in the house, everything in the house was just covered with a thick, and I say thick, I would estimate probably a half-inch of dust on nearly everything in the house. And at noon, at that time, people didn't have refrigerators and freezers and such, and after the big meal on Sunday, the leftovers were all covered, with each one covered, and then a clean cloth would be laid over the whole thing on the table. And so the boy's mother kind of laughed and said, well, at least we could eat. And so because all they had to do was very carefully remove that dust-covered rag, and we had supper ready for us there. But and then when the dust was still blowing, when we went to bed, and we were all dead tired from being so scared for so long and such, and so. But when we woke up the next morning, we all were covered with dust. We hadn't learned to cover our heads and such at that point, because that was the first storm like that. But those storms were really something to put up with. There are a lot of stories to tell. They would be so bad, and at that time they didn't have weather forecasts and such. what they were was dry cold fronts coming through, and they would pick. You could tell where this cold front came from by the color of the dust. But if they came all the way down from Colorado, they would be a nice brown color. If they came out of the hills of New Mexico, they would have a yellow tone to them. So we could tell where they came from due to the color of the dirt. And I remember there was one story of Perryton about they would get notice. Someone would phone ahead and such, and they got word that there was a bad one heading for our area, and so they had to get the majority of the kids in the school were rural. There were very few of us lived in town. Actually, I'd say maybe 20% of us lived in town, and they had to bus the rest. And one bus with 30 kids on it was stranded at a farmhouse overnight. And that would have been quite an experience for that much. I can imagine what it was like for the poor man and woman that they took care of them. But gosh, what would they do with that many kids?
What did y'all do in the dust storms later on?
In the dust storms, we carried a little gauze mask with us, and if we could, we would dampen it and put that gauze mask on to breathe when the dust storm was blowing. And that summer, we were hit in Perryton with what they call dust pneumonia, which was really a bad thing. In Perryton, which was a little trading town for farmers and such, it probably didn't have over maybe 3,000 people living in it at the time. Although it was the county seat too. It was Ochiltree County seat. But where was I?
You're talking about the dust pneumonia.
About what?
Dust pneumonia.
The what?
Dust pneumonia.
Oh yeah, the dust pneumonia. There was an average of one death a day for the 3 months that was hitting people there, and they just called it dust pneumonia. Anyway, James Arthur came down with it. It was the summer of his 6th birthday, and he was so sick that they just gave up. The doctors couldn't do anything for the patients anyway, except make them comfortable, and so they sent Ophelia and myself out to Uncle Arthur's farm to stay out there because they didn't want us to be in the house when James Arthur died. And but he wanted a red straw hat, and so Daddy had gotten him his red straw hat, and he wore the thing out in bed. But he fooled him. He got well. He really wasn't well enough to go back to school, but he had built up this idea of going to school so much that they let him go ahead and start school. And he didn't do much the first year, but he did enough to pass on to the 2nd grade, but that wasn't much because he was a smart kid. But he was just so run down he was just skin and bones, but he lived through dust pneumonia.
Do you have any memories of your Uncle Arthur's?
What?
Do you have any memories of your Uncle Arthur's?
Uncle Arthur? Oh, I have lots of memories of Uncle Arthur. They're tied in, started when we were living in Perryton, because he lived just about 6.5 miles from us in Perryton, just barely over his quarter section of land. His home quarter section bordered Texas at the top of the Panhandle. And so we went out there quite often. He put 3 or 4 of his children through college in the Dust Bowl by raising chickens and having eggs and chickens to sell, and with his garden. He had a huge garden, and he had a very good windmill. And so he irrigated his garden, and he put those kids through colleges and about once every 6 or 8 weeks he'd load up his wagon with whatever he had to take and take it to the college and give it to the college for the tuition of the kids. But now his older children I hardly knew. I met them later in life and whatnot. But Marie was, she was already, the first memories I have of them, she was already married and gone. But I didn't see much of her. And another of the daughters lived near Oklahoma City. We usually saw them once a year when they would come. Well, we'd go see them too. But and then when should I go ahead and talk about working for him?
Yeah.
When we were living in Pampa, my junior and senior years in high school, Uncle Arthur called and had me go to work for him. And I would work all summer for about 2 months, and during the wheat harvest and everything. And that was 2 of the happiest summers of my life. I always had enjoyed going out to Grandpa's place in New Mexico, especially. But those two summers that I worked for Uncle Arthur were just special. I learned a lot. Among other things, I got real proficient at milking cows because he kept his cows. He was still selling the. He would separate the milk and cream and feed the plain milk to his hogs and sell the cream. And he had a bunch of chickens that had to be taken care of and all that. And however, Aunt Emma and Audine usually took care of the chickens and the garden, but which was a lot of work for the 2 of them. Mm-hmm. But I especially enjoyed getting up before sunup and going out and driving the cows in to milk them, because they would be turned loose after milking them at night, and they inevitably were at the far end of the pasture, which was it was a quarter of a quarter or so. It was about a half mile or 3/4 of a mile to get them. But the sunrises are glorious in the Panhandle, and I thoroughly enjoyed going out and doing that. Even if it was raining, I enjoyed it. But I'd go out and drive in the cows, and then we would milk, and then after that we would wash up and have breakfast, and then we would go out as soon as we could. We would go out into the fields to work, and we'd have to wait for the dew to be gone to run the combines. But it didn't take long for that to happen, as dry as it was. But we had I just enjoyed the work. I learned to drive a tractor, and that was the only vehicle that I had ever driven in my life until after my experience with the Air Force and being a pilot. But it was just good work for good people, and I enjoyed it. Let's see, what have I got here? And we had a tornado in Perryton. That was really something. Actually, it was a series of a string of smaller tornadoes, and one of them came right through our end of Perryton, missed our house about half a block. But we saw that there was a tornado, and so we, our neighbor right across the street, Mrs. Van Gilder, and we have a picture of her holding a litter of Beans pups. But we went into her cellar under the house for that, and it blew by and didn't do any damage where we were. My dad, for some reason, stayed in the house, and he said that he watched the end of his truck, the bed of his truck, rise and fall, the whole thing, about 2 feet in those gusts of wind. So they were pretty strong. And one of our neighbors, just a half a block away, lost the roof of his house. The whole thing was just as if it had been cut off intentionally, and it didn't disturb anything in the house. His wife had a lot of doodads on top of their piano and that type of thing. Didn't move anything in the house. Just took off the roof. And there was, of course, we went driving around to see what damage had been done to every place. And there was a farmhouse. The people had come in, and they had come in to church. That was a Sunday afternoon, too. And they had set their table, prepared their table, so they would just come home, and I'm sure they had all cold cuts and stuff for lunch, which a lot of the people did at that time instead. And because they would go to church and not get home until about 1 o'clock. And the table had been set, and the house was in the shape of a T. And the tornado took off the stem of the T and left the cross piece. And where it tore that off, it took the complete wall out and didn't disturb anything on the other side. And that table that had been set and such was set against the wall. And the tablecloth, everything was just left normally, you know. So tornadoes do strange things. Mm-hmm. And those are, I guess, just about it for Perryton.
Okay, that's good.